We've already got our first question. That's great. I have a feeling you all are going to throw some great curveballs at me this morning. All right, well, we'll get started. I'm sure we'll have people joining throughout the process. Thank you for joining us today. Our team has been working hard to make sure we can communicate out what's happening. We will make these slides available. We are recording this, and we'll be sending updates out to membership and to the attendees here with some of this written down and you can ask any questions in the chat now, or you can find us later if things aren't addressed or if we failed to answer it sufficiently. The agenda, I'm going to quickly go over the overview of minimum wage, tipped wage, very simple. Do a very quick rundown of ESTA, what happened at the highest level. And then I'm going to go through each of those items with a little bit more context. It might be a little repetitive, but I'm sure it's going to generate conversation or questions. And then we'll do Q&A and we'll wrap up. I want to thank Blue Cross Blue Shield, Amway, Business Leaders United, and Rome Manufacturing for supporting our department's work. We do these first Friday calls, typically on first Friday, but we called an audible and are calling it on the third Friday. If you want to join those, you can find how to on our website. So what you need to know, the tipped wage is going to remain at 38% this year. It'll rise to 40% on January 1, 2026, and then increase 2% a year until it hits the cap of 50% on January 1st, 2031. The min wage is going to increase to $15 an hour, and beginning on January 1, 2027, will be adjusted annually based on the Midwest Region Consumer Price Index. So min wage looks like this. It's a little bit more simplified. It's actually slightly faster than what was previously going to be in effect today. And then tipped wage, you can see how it goes up 2% every year until it hits 2031. With that, employers that fail to pay the tipped minimum wage required are now subject to a civil fine up to $2,500. ESTA is a little more complicated. So, of course, I've got like all these boxes in my view, so I can't see. Here's the high level. Small businesses are now 10 or fewer employees. It was 9 or fewer. And those small businesses must provide 40 hours of paid leave. And there is no longer a 32 hours of unpaid. And they have until October 1st of this year to track the accrual, track the items, essentially to comply with the act. Classifications of employees. There's an independent contractors kind of exemption, and we'll talk about that language. But specifically, unpaid trainees, unpaid interns, youth wage workers, as defined in the law, are exempt. The really strong points of this compromise are that if a PTO policy exceeds 72 hours, you no longer have to provide, you can provide that, and it no longer has to be under the same terms and conditions. That language was eliminated, and we'll go through that. You can restrict use to after 120 days. For usage, it was 90, and the employer that can allow leave to be taken in increments smaller than an hour, but 1 hour is the standard unless the employer elects to do a smaller increment. Private right of action or rebuttable presumption are eliminated. Front loading is also, like PTO bank, is much better. You can front load the 72 hours or 40 if you are in a small business under the act, and you no longer have to, it specifically says you don't have to track accrual, carryover, or payout any unused time. New businesses are exempt for 3 places. See, I was writing this at midnight. Are exempt for 3 years. I'll fix that before we email it out. Wage calculations, specifically now exempt overtime, bonuses, tips, commissions. Cleared up a lot of that. I know folks were worried about. Leave notice is now 7 days, stays with 7 days if foreseeable. But if unforeseeable, we'll talk about it. You can now have provide a written policy that an employee will have to comply with. No call, no show. If an employee fails to follow that written policy and you provide the appropriate notice, as we'll talk about, you can take action, personnel action on that employee. And then part-time or seasonal, you can front load for part-time. Seasonal is addressed indirectly through the 120 days and the carryover if an individual leaves and comes back to your business. So we'll talk about that. Key changes. Again, some of this will be repeated. Advance notice is if foreseeable. You may require 7 days notice. That's no change. If unforeseeable, in either of the following manner, as soon as practical remains, but it says, or in accordance with an employer's policy related to requesting or using leave if both of the following are met. So you must comply with these 2 points. The employer provides a written copy of the policy that includes procedures for how an employee must provide notice, and that requirement allows an employee to provide notice after the employee is aware of the need. So, I had a family have an urgent issue. I'm aware of it now. My employer must allow me to then provide that notice. So then I will provide notice following that policy. That is much more workable, much more in line with standard employment processes. An employer cannot deny use of time that is not foreseeable if the employer did not provide that written policy, or if the employer made a change that written policy did not provide notice within 5 days after the change. An employer may take adverse personal action against an employee who uses time for a purpose outside of those prescribed in the act, or if they violate the notice requirements. Key changes on definitions of employee. They retain the U.S. government employee. This is the independent contracting piece, an individual who works in accordance with a policy if both conditions are met. It allows the individual to schedule their own hours, and that policy prohibits the employer from taking adverse personnel actions for failure to schedule a minimum number of hours. Kind of coming at from the side, I've already gotten questions this morning in an email about very specific challenges there. I see my good friend Lisa Cooper on there. I'm going to ask her at some point to maybe weigh in on that, but we'll keep going for now. Unpaid trainee or intern. Unpaid trainee has a bunch of language around it about that it can't provide benefit to the business and all these things. And then an individual employed in accordance with the Youth Employment Standards Act. Private right of action and rebuttable presumption are eliminated. Fantastic. When it comes to the uses of leave, family member definition, there's a whole section of definitions, no longer includes individuals related by affinity to the employee. I know that was something that was very vague and general, and people were worried about where do you draw the line? How do you have certainty around that? So that's eliminated, which is good. There is still the language that an individual whose close association with the employee is equivalent of a family relationship. So much more specific than related by affinity, but just something to keep in mind is that, if you do have policies about, especially if you're separating out your unsick time and you want them to follow very closely the specifics allowed in law, that this is a key part of that still. Again, we talked about small businesses that are now 10 and fewer. That is the size of your business the count is employees on payroll during any 20 or more calendar work weeks for this year or the previous. So seasonal, if you end up with 22 weeks at 11 people, you are not a small business. Something to keep in mind. Small businesses do not need to comply until October. A small business specifically is not required to do any of the following before October 1. Allow an employee to accrue, provide paid earned sick time to an employee as an alternative to accrual, or calculate and track accrual. Tracking and usage, it's still 1 hour for every 30 hours worked, but it adds specific exemption of paid time off. So if you're offering 2 buckets and they're taking paid time off, it now says specifically that does not count towards that 30 hours work. This is capped at 40 hours annually for small business and 72 hours for all others. An employer may select a higher limit. A lot of language tweaks were going from an employer may limit to an employer may select a higher, kind of instead of having the employer have to be the bad guy, I guess it's a positive. You can allow more if you want. Accrual begins on the effective date of the act which is hopefully today. The governor is in review of the bill, um, or upon commencement of employment, whichever is later. And a new employee can be required to wait 120 days, which was formerly 90. Time may be used in 1 hour increment or the smallest increment the employer uses to account for absences. So that language has changed. It was the smallest time that the employer uses up, but it's up to the employee. Now it's you can limit it to 1 hour. But if you track absence in 15 minutes, you can consider if you want your employees to be able to take or use their time in those smaller increments. Front loading. This is my favorite part. As an alternative to accrual, a business may provide an employee a minimum of 72 hours, or 40 if you're small business, of paid earned sick time at the beginning of the year. And an employer that front loads does not need to allow for carryover, calculate and track accrual, or pay the employee the value of unused time. So when we talk about the administrative burden and all the stuff that businesses have been panicking about the last several months, this is a big portion of that. Single bucket PTO greatly improves the ability to provide PTO instead of separating. An employer is in compliance if they provide at least the same amount of PTO as required in the act that may be used for the same purposes. So if you have a bucket and they can use it for everything, which includes the stuff for under earned sick time, then that will satisfy the act. It eliminated this burdensome same terms and conditions language, which combined with everything else made it really much more challenging for individuals, especially complex companies, to offer single bucket PTO. Part-time employees may front load under these conditions. You must provide written notice of how many hours the employee is expected to work for a year at the time of hire. The earned sick time provided must be at least proportional to the earned sick time that would have been accrued. So, if you say they're going to work 200 hours, it must be proportional to if they had worked 200 hours. Obviously, it makes sense. If more hours are worked, however, the employer must provide sufficient benefits to those that would have been accrued. So keeping in mind to follow up and true up, if your employees were expected to work 200 and they work 250, then you must make sure that you cover that gap in their earned benefits. Rollover, if you do not front load now, it was unlimited, you must allow carryover up to 72 hours or 40 for small business, unless the employer selects a higher limit. If you front load again, this is eliminated. Calculations of wage specifically do not include overtime pay, holiday pay, bonuses, commissions, supplemental pay, piece rate pay, tips, or gratuities. Just a couple other definitions and we're almost done. Other calculations, year is a regular and consecutive 12-month period as determined by the employer. An employee that is exempt from overtime is assumed to have worked 40 hours a week unless that employee's normal work week is less, in which case that time accrues based on that normal work week. An employee is assumed to have worked less than 40 hours each week or 30 hours in a small business. Oh, documentation. So there was a small tweak to documentation. You may require reasonable documentation for time greater than 3 consecutive days off, but the employer still must cover any expenses associated with that cost. So if the employee needs to take a bus to get there or mileage, it's pretty broad. You still must cover all the costs associated with it. The change is that the employee must provide that documentation within 15 days. Before it was kind of as soon as possible or as soon as practical. Maybe I don't have the language directly in front of me, but they put a day count on that. Oh, returning employees. If an employee is reinstated with a company within 6 months, it was before, they would continue on. So I left Cooper People Group, and after a couple of months, I'm like, man, I really miss working for Lisa. I want to get back there. I come back. I maintain everything I had accrued and not used. Now it is only 2 months. This is getting at some of that seasonal work a little bit. If you're employing people throughout the summer, or maybe slightly more than half the year, and they leave, you don't have to worry about providing all those benefits at the front end of next time. It's also, when you combine that with 120 days instead of 90 days of waiting period, I think it's making things a little bit more predictable for kind of those industries that rely heavily on part-time and seasonal work. Before we get to questions, and I see I have 51, I just want to thank everyone who's been a part of this. My team did amazing work, but they could not do it without all of you. I want to specifically shout out to Jose Gonzalez at Preferred Flooring, Chris Anderson at the Mitten, Cindy Ann Arbor at DK, Jill Malone at Plune for having the courage to testify, also talk to the media, and a lot more people did that. But a lot of you sent emails and it made a difference. I was texting with the Senate Majority Leader this morning, thanking her. A lot of work went into this, and everyone that spoke up helped provide the push to do that. It is hard to do big things. Obviously, it took to the 11th hour, and we feel we got a good compromise. So I want to just, again, thank everyone that's provided their feedback to us or has participated in this process. I've never seen as much engagement as we had on this issue. So with that, you can bother Josh at grandup.org or Jackie at grandup.org with questions, but let's go ahead and start rattling through the ones I've got in the chat. So I'll stop my share, and I hope my head is on straight enough. Are temporary gig or variable hours exempt from ESTA based on these new modification? Again, you're going to have to look at those definitions of who is an employee. If they are an employee, they are going to qualify. But again, you can, if they're setting their own working hours and you're not requiring a minimum, they should be exempt. That's independent contracting. But if they're an employee, then you should look at how they would accrue, or if you want to front load. All those things are now kind of more specified. There are very few outright exemptions in this act. Someone asks, and if someone wants to go deeper on that, I can get a little bit nerdier later, or we can send it out in the follow-up. Are nonprofits exempt? This is causing a lot of, this is the next three questions at least. They eliminated a sentence or a word from employer, who an employer is in this. And my colleagues who I've been working with across the state have been texting about this all morning. Our understanding is it does not exempt nonprofits right now. I don't know if someone else on the call, if we have an attorney that wants to chime in. They eliminated the word nonprofit, but it still says, or any other organization that employs one or more employees in the state. And I don't know how a nonprofit is not required to follow this act under that. So yeah, it specifically says employer means any person, firm, business,
Just look over her
educational.
signed this yet. I believe she did already, didn't she?
Yeah, I thought she did.
Oh, someone's muted. Um, company, government entity, or any other entity that employs one or more individuals. And again, to me, a nonprofit is another entity that employs one or more individuals. I know there was a lot of optimism that when they took out nonprofit agency, that nonprofits were exempt. I have not seen any direction saying that they are not. If an employer has reason to believe time is being taken for ESTA qualifying reason, should they designate that ESTA time even if the employee doesn't request it? Lisa, you want to bail me out on this? I mean, that's probably a policy issue, but I feel like if they don't request it as ESTA and you have it separate and they're taking time, that it would come out of the other bucket. What do you think, Lisa?
Yeah, great question. Unclear. It's probably going to depend on how your policy is written to a certain extent. I would want to make sure that my employee knew that they would be eligible for this job protected paid leave. And I would encourage us to have folks use it, right? The faster you burn through it. So I think a lot of us will probably write our policies to carve that out to say if it's an eligible under ESTA, we're going to apply it as part of ESTA leave. And that I think meets the intent and the spirit of the law as well, right? Where we want to make sure that folks are getting this paid time and it's job protected leave when they have a qualifying sick or personal event that qualifies under the act.
Thank you. Someone asked, can we provide ESTA time on their employee anniversary? Yes, the employer can determine what that 12-month calendar is. Are you allowed to front load if you use a separate ESTA bank? I know you can front load if you combine it. I see no reason why you couldn't. I think my mind was all, I like, in our world, it's easier just to have it in one bucket, but I know for some it's better to have it separate. You should be able to and still be exempt from having to track accrual and all that, as long as you're providing the benefit. Can we still hold people accountable for being tardy in document, even if they state they weren't feeling as to why they were late? Again, if you provide a written policy that allows them to notify you after an unforeseeable event, again, so I wake up and feel ill and I'm late, I have to follow the policy so long as I received that and you followed that option. So I'll call in and say, hey, I'm feeling ill. If they were late, are they requesting to have used that time as earned sick time? Would be my question. Because if they are, then you can't really hold them accountable as long as they followed your written policy. I mean, the real improvement on the tardiness and the concern around no call, no show has been that that you can have a written policy. Before it was only as soon as practicable. Lots of questions about nonprofits. If we receive different advice on that, I will communicate. But again, I feel pretty strongly that they will not be exempt. Is there a delay with implementing these changes? I've heard 30 days from when the governor signs it. People are given, again, for small business, it's October 1st. Leo also announced that they are not enforcing in the near future, and they'll be providing guidance on that, and we will communicate that out as well. Does the employee have to follow our call-in procedure and policy and notify us per our policy 3 hours in advance that they are calling in? Again, you can have a written policy, but it says specifically that it must allow them to communicate it after they had the unforeseen event. So again, maybe I twist my ankle bad on the way to work. If it's less than 3 hours in advance, you can't not let me call that in. Was there a change to employers covering the cost of documentation? No. Just that the deadline is 15 days if you want them to provide that documentation for them. I would like to know how to calculate the hourly rate for ESTA for tipped employees. Tips are now excluded, right? Lisa's shaking her head. I'm like, help me. Go ahead.
They're excluded. So it's that base rate. It's at your hourly rate of pay. And commissions and other sort of variable pay, piece rate pay. I think you covered that in one of the earlier slides.
Yeah. With nonprofit organizations attempt, I have NPOs. It's not a nonprofit, is it? It is exempt. What happens? So again, I am not reading this as nonprofits are exempt. It is not just our call that I'm hearing this. This is blowing up everywhere across the state right now. I think even some associations have put out that nonprofits are exempt. And I really hope that we get clarification from the department as soon as possible. And then someone goes, will you please clarify nonprofit church requirements with mostly part-time staff, especially nursing workers who are very limited time? Also, we operate on a cash basis. How this is going to be challenging. I knew we'd get tough questions. With part-time, again, you can front load, or you must provide 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. I don't know how cash basis would impact.
I don't think that has any merit, like how you function, how your accounting function functions. That's sort of a moot point.
Yeah. So if it takes them all year to get to 30 hours, you're still tracking and having to accrue that. It might be easier to front load if so you don't have to worry about accrual. You don't have to worry about creating a whole new system for how you track time and usage and carryover. If current PTO policy is one bucket and compliant with ESTA requirements, what should our main focus be on changes? I can answer this from me, but I'll look at Lisa Cooper. Cooper People Group is I think our biggest thing as we just did it for our team, is our leave notice requirement is now we can have a written policy about what do you do for that unforeseen event. Lisa, what would you advise?
I think it depends on your policy. I mean, we have written well over 50 policies for employers across the region, and none of them are the same. So I could say none for you, and five things have to change for David or Teresa or Bethany, right? So I think you have to look at your policy and look at each of these items line by line. And Josh, I'm sure you're going to send out the slide deck afterward, or it'll be available
Yes.
on your website. So I think I would just dust off my policy. I know I'm expecting that Leo will be releasing a new poster. We'll have the updated documentation as well. I would also be paying attention to my accruals and the dates of effect, especially on a small employer, right? If I don't have to worry about this until October, I might just punt things in my HRIS or time and attendance system for a little bit. Again, if you've already got the toothpaste out of the tube, it might be a little hard to put it back in. So I think you're going to probably have some internal dialogue about what you want to do, when you want to do it, especially for those of us that have less than 10 folks.
Can we have our normal PTO accrual, which does comply with ESTA, for full-time and for part-time employees do just the 1 hour? The advice you can do a lot of different things. The advice I've seen is it's going to be easier if you do it based on classifications of employees. But yes, as long as you're compliant with the act, if you want to have different systems, you can tackle things differently. It depends. It also is how do you want to communicate that to your teams? Pay the minimum wage instead of tipped wages for bartenders. Are we still obligated to pay them the minimum wage instead of tipped wage? Is our choice one or the other? Nothing is really changing with who is a tipped employee and who is not. The big difference is what is that tipped credit, and that the minimum wage is going to be increasing. So both those costs will be going up over the next 6 years, and then set to the rate of inflation. I'm just making sure I don't miss this or choice one or the other. Change can we still pay it? If we change the tipped wages, can we still pay them? You can always pay more. If I'm reading this right, if you want to have a higher wage than the minimum, it is the minimum wage even for tipped employees. So if you want to say this is your base at $11 and provide tips on top, that is a employer choice. Can you delay usage for one group of employees and not another?
Once I'm eligible and I'm accruing that time, right, I'm able to use it so long as I meet the eligibility, requirements that outlined by the act. If I've earned that time, I get to use it.
Can you have different policies for salary exempt and hourly employees? Yes, that's come up a lot. Our company's employees substitute teachers across the entire state who are able to accept or reject assignments. Oh, this is a tough one, Lisa. I'm glad you're here.
Well, I'm not an attorney, I will say that. So I'm kind of a wannabe. So I think some of this stuff will probably rely on our legal counsel and or Leo to provide further clarity. And that's probably one I would take to them because I don't want to misguide you and speak out of turn, because this is literally the ink is still dry on this thing, right?
Yeah.
Not even quite dry yet.
I'm going to keep rolling a little bit. I know we're up against our time. Carryover for accrued hours is eliminated if you front load. If you do not front load, you have to allow for at least 72 hours for regular whatever businesses, and then 40 for the small businesses, 10 and under. Seasonal rehire employees can be restricted to usage using after 120 days each year. Yes. Again, if they come back within 2 months, that time accrued is still theirs. Wage calculation shift premium does not have to be included. That is correct, I believe. Curious, what is the risk of keeping one PTO bucket if we are giving a front loaded minimum of 104 hours? We will lower our notice to 7 days from otherwise. I think that's a lot of folks that have one PTO bucket that they find it valuable have stayed with that like we did. Now that it's a benefit because you can now your tracking in the back end will be eliminated, especially if you front load that PTO bucket. And you can have a better leave notice requirement than under what would have been in place. If you opt not to front load, are we required to then pay out unused? No, you can if you don't want to track carryover. So if you're doing accrual and they're accruing, it's the end of the year and they have 15 hours left and you don't want to track that in the next year, you can pay out those 15 hours. one PTO bank if offered 72 hours to confirm. We do not have to add an ESTA terms and conditions. You do not have to add an ESTA terms and conditions, but it still says 7 days for foreseeable and unforeseeable. So you still follow those. You just don't have, it's just much better than it was before, if that makes sense. Can we front load for the great employees and have all others earn sick time? I would stick with classifications or find a way to address that. That cracks me up. If you have two businesses that started August 20, I do not have to. Okay, this is a good question. I have not seen guidance on this yet, but I think our team was talking about it. The new business at 3 years, someone in the legislature told me if you're like, so if I'm a 1 year old, I don't have to comply for 2 more years. You're shaking your head, Lisa, is that what you've heard? I will find
That's
out.
that's how I inferred it. I'm not sure I've heard it, but that's how I interpreted it.
The staff negotiating this on the House side has said that is how they intended it and that's how they wrote it. So I feel comfortable that that's where I'm at right now. Has the governor signed it? Has she signed it? I'm looking at it. I haven't seen the breaking news yet. I heard it was in final legal review. Marcus is looking. I really don't want to stop this call because these are good questions. Are employers still liable for any EE out of, yes, you're liable for expenses for doctor's notes. We had an option to be paid for unused PTO as long as they still have at least 100 hours remaining. So anything exceeding 100 hours in their PTO bank. With the changes in carryover, can we continue this in our PTO policy?
I think it's fine. I mean, so long as you're giving me the time, you're letting me use the time. If you want to give me an added benefit of letting me cash it out or roll it over some extra amount, I think that's above what the law requires, but go on with your bad self. If you want to do it.
Jackie is saying the governor will sign it by noon today. The other question I actually had this morning, Lisa, that I thought was really good is, now I'm just blanking. I had to get more sleep. Incentives. They were wondering if we have a perfect attendance incentive, is that still retaliatory? And I did not know the answer to that one.
Yeah, so use caution, because the way it was previously written was, as long as it was an ESTA approved absence, right? Yeah, I couldn't get attendance points for that. So my logic would say the same thing still applies, right? Because that's an ESTA approved thing. So you can't ding me or take other adverse employment action under my attendance policy or any other policy, right? So use caution with that.
All right, I'm going to answer 5 more questions, and then I am getting told that what we're going to do is send out the documents. We have AI recording this. We have these questions taken down, and we are going to go through them and try to consolidate this into an FAQ and get it out to this group, as well as use it in some of our general communications. So real quick, if an employer is front loading, does the full amount of hours need to be available as of today? Or if they decide the employee anniversary date is their benefit year, would someone with a July hire date be waiting until for the front loaded hours? I think you have to prorate it. I mean, so it's accrual starts on effective date of the act for current employees. I'm trying to think through this. Or if they decided the employee anniversary date. I would bet you have to prorate it if you're going to start. Like if I'm July 1 from now until then, and I'm a current employee, you have to have some type of benefit.
Yes.
Youth worker. What does youth worker mean? High schoolers? It's defined in law. I am not an expert on youth workers. I think you have to have a youth permit.
Yeah. So minors under the age of 18 are covered by that legislation. And there's different 15, 16 have different rules for, 17-year-olds and things like that. So.
Okay. We kind of answer this. If we require a 2-hour call-in prior, can we still apply our discipline policy if they do not follow that? Again, you have to, that was a serious part of the negotiations that went till 11 something last night is they have to have the ability to call in after they find out. So again, if they wake up with a cough and it's an hour before shift, they need the ability to say this isn't I can't come in or I'm going to be late. Is the minimum wage for minors still going to be 85%? Shoot, we didn't have that in the slide. I think so. We'll put it in the FAQ. I'm sorry. I've been so focused on ESTA. Okay, last question. What if we front loaded at the beginning of 2025? Does what we already provided count towards the requirements? Man, you guys are good. So you front loaded this year and they already provided it. I don't know, Lisa. That's a tough one. We might have to look at that.
Roseanne, are you on the call? Because I think you've had this question. I might punt it to Roseanne if she's still with us.
Yes, I'm still on the call and we have answered this question. If you already front loaded it, it does apply. ESTA doesn't require that everybody restarts their year and gives everybody a new bucket of time. So you can require it. If you have people that have already used up all of their time, that question has come up too. Like we gave it in January and they used all of it. We're saying just drop a note in their file that as of this date, it was all used up, just so you can go back and reference that.
So I'm sorry, we're gonna wrap it here. I need to I thanked a lot of people. I want to doubly thank again Lisa and her team at Cooper People Group because they've been a huge help. And this was not intended today, but I saw Lisa yesterday. I'm like, you're gonna be on the call, I hope, because people ask really hard questions, and I am not an HR professional. Please keep bugging us if we don't get you your answers. We are happy to continue to respond. Our job is to help you through this. We really appreciate all your engagement. We're really excited that this is made so much better. We know it not everything that people wanted, but I do want to thank, I promised her I would this morning. I do want to thank Speaker Hall, Senate Majority Leader Brinks for their commitment. It was hard. And to stay at the table with this deadline approaching and how tough politically some of these things were, I really appreciate it. And it's going to make a huge difference for our West Michigan, particularly for small business community. So with that, again, please keep checking in. Our team is already starting to go through a list of all the questions and we will get on them as soon as possible. Have a great day.